This is a story about war, relationships, and the fragile architecture of global order. It is a close reading of a conversation that reveals more than the words themselves. It exposes anxieties about leadership, strategy, and the human cost of protracted conflict. The voice you will hear aims to guide, to contextualize, and to hold space for the facts and the unanswered questions that follow. He begins with a personal note, a line that sounds almost intimate but carries weight in international politics. Vladimir and I had a very good relationship. That phrase matters because it is not merely nostalgia, it is a calibrating detail, a reminder that geopolitics is often personal, that history between leaders shapes expectations about outcomes. Yet the memory of friendship, of mutual respect, quickly gives way to frustration. I don't know why he continues with this war, the speaker says. Those 5 words carry a world of implications, yes, political, moral, strategic. Think about the scale he describes, a war that should have been finished quickly, a conflict stretching into what he calls 4 years. He lists costs in blunt human terms, soldiers lost, people wounded, limbs gone, lives ruined. The catalogue of damage is delivered with a mix of anger, bewilderment, and sorrow. It's a horrible war, he says. The phrase is simple, but its bluntness makes it piercing. It serves as the first unvarnished judgment. From that point, the narrative widens. The speaker compares expectations and realities. He admits surprise, twice, about the tenacity of those resisting invasion. Who would think that Ukraine could have fought Russia for 4 years to essentially a standstill? The surprise is not just rhetorical, it is an admission that strategy and resilience have outpaced predictions, that initial assumptions about shock and collapse were wrong. That reality reshapes alliances, supplies, and calculations in capitals the world over. But alongside recognition of Ukrainian resilience, there is critique, pointed and public. Biden should have never let that happen, he says, a sentence that collapses entire debates about preparedness, deterrence, and the moment of invasion into a single stark claim. Whether you agree or disagree, the assertion is consequential. It assigns blame, creates a narrative about responsibility, and signals how leaders and their policies will be judged in the telling. Equally consequential are the images he invokes of scarcity, long lines waiting for gasoline in Russia right now. It is a domestic detail with international meaning. When citizens wait in line for fuel, when supply chains strain and economies falter, popular legitimacy is tested. That fact is a political pressure point. It becomes an instrument in the arithmetic of power. Sanction regimes bite, logistics fail, and ordinary people feel the strain. The speaker frames this as proof of systemic failure and as a possible lever for change. Yet he tempers criticism with a wish. I'd like to see him do well. That line complicates the cast of characters. It is not simply condemnation. It is a reluctant hope that rivalry need not be personal destruction. There is a paradox. He counsels better outcomes for an adversary while blasting the same adversary's choices. That ambivalence explains much about modern diplomacy. Human beings, even rival leaders, retain affinities even as they clash. Those affinities can be used as leverage or be sources of frustration. Here also the blunt calculus about what could end the conflict. He could end it. He could end it quickly. The capacity to stop a war, in the speaker's view, lies within the hands of the battlefield commander, the political leader deciding whether to press an advantage or withdraw. The emphasis is on choice. War is presented not as fate, but as a set of decisions that produce consequences, human and strategic. The narrative turns again to the bravery and cost on the ground. He praises Ukrainian endurance, acknowledging what seemed impossible months earlier. And yet, the praise is shaded by realism. This is not a symbolic victory. It is a grinding attrition that has reconfigured the map of expectations. The line between admiration and alarm is thin. A standing enemy that refuses to collapse forces an opponent into longer, costlier calculations. This is the strategic backdrop to another element of the conversation, the weaponry. He wants weapons. He would like to have tomahawks, the speaker mentions, using a specific term, a type of cruise missile with long-range capabilities. The invocation of weapons changes the tone from moral and political critique to the mechanics of modern warfare. It draws attention to supply chains, to missile inventories, to the strategic choices democracies face when deciding how much to provide and on what terms. The question of supplying tomahawks is not a mere detail. It is a symbol of escalation, deterrence, and the thresholds that allies must weigh. The language then shifts to negotiation and leverage. When he asks hypothetically, do you need any tomahawks? The question is playful but loaded. It suggests bargaining, the trading of hardware for influence, commitments, or strategic alignment. In global politics, weapons are both tools of defense and currencies of persuasion. They alter battlefield math and diplomatic relationships. And then the conversation steers toward trade. I'm going to put tariffs on your... The sentence trails off, but the intent is clear. If diplomacy and force do not contain the problem, economic levers will be used. Tariffs have become a predictable instrument in the toolkit of foreign policy, applied to punish, to protect domestic industries, or to signal displeasure. They reorder market incentives and can inflict chronic pain on already fragile economies. The Speaker is counting on them as a blunt instrument that can produce political consequences. Across these remarks runs a recurring theme, the interconnectedness of policy domains. Military campaigns do not happen in isolation. They ripple into domestic economies, alliances, and long-term reputations. A leader's decision on the battlefield will show up later at the petrol pump, in the factory line, and at the ballot box. That is the layered logic that the Speaker emphasises. We should also look at the rhetorical strategies in play. The Speaker alternates between moral outrage and strategic calculation. He uses personal memory, I had a very good relationship, to establish credibility, then moves swiftly to public critique. That rhetorical shift accomplishes two goals. It softens the critique with personal recollection, making it less purely partisan, and it amplifies the drama, turning a private tie into a public standard by which failure is judged. This is not merely commentary, it is the making of public opinion. Next, consider the human ledger he invokes. Lost 1.5 million soldiers, an image that is almost numbing in scale. Numbers of this magnitude demand scrutiny. Whether exact or rhetorical, they are meant to communicate the scale of sacrifice. When leaders use large figures, they ask publics to reckon with the human toll, to see the conflict not as a sterile strategic contest, but as a cascade of personal tragedies. The moral force of that account is one of the most potent tools in shaping opinion, and yet even in the face of such loss, the Speaker's tone contains a measure of astonishment and grudging respect. I give credit because who would think that Ukraine could have fought Russia for 4 years to essentially a standstill? That acknowledgement recasts the narrative. It moves away from assigning blame alone and toward recognizing agency on both sides, resistance where collapse was predicted, endurance where speed was expected. Realpolitik is messy, courage makes it messier. Beyond the battlefield, the conversation is an exercise in signalling. Public remarks like these are not just personal opinions. They are signals to allies and adversaries alike. They broadcast willingness to use economic measures to supply certain weapons and to publicly judge leadership failures. They shape the perceptions of decision makers in capitals, the calculations of generals, and the morale of citizens. At its core, then, the passage asks us to think about the mechanics of modern conflict, how decisions are made, how alliances are tested, and how public narratives are constructed. It asks us to ask whether wars are the result of miscalculation, miscommunication, or design. It interrogates the very idea of victory today. Is victory measured in territory, in attrition, in political survival, in the restoration of normal life? The Speaker suggests that the answers are muddled and that leaders are responsible for restoring clarity. Now reflect on the domestic pressures described, long lines for gasoline, collapsing economies, wounded soldiers. These are all symptoms of broader systemic stress. They are the pressures that produce political change domestically. Regimes that cannot feed, clothe and protect their people will lose legitimacy. That is an important lesson for citizens everywhere. Democracy, autocracy, hybrid regimes, none are immune to the material facts of daily life. Yet the international community faces a dilemma. When a state engages in protracted aggression, when it inflicts vast loss, the response options are imperfect. Military intervention risks escalation, providing weapons risks prolonging bloodshed, and economic sanctions harm civilians while pressuring regimes. Each choice has moral and practical trade-offs. The Speaker's commentary captures the painful arithmetic of those choices. We also need to situate the remarks in the wider strategic environment. The mention of tomahawks and tariffs signals a mixed approach. Sustain the defenders with precise, powerful weapons while simultaneously using economic pressure to degrade adversary capacity. It is a two-track strategy of hard power and economic coercion. That blend has become a hallmark of contemporary statecraft, especially among coalitions that prefer to avoid direct ground intervention. In this context, alliances are critical. The conversation hints that the president coming in on Friday will be asking for weapons, that allies are negotiating the types and numbers of systems to be provided. These are not just logistical details, they are political theatre. Each pledged shipment, each public visit, and each private consultation helps shape the battlefield and the diplomatic calendar. They create expectations and, at times, constraints. The Speaker's candidness about mistakes, Biden should have never let that happen, is notable for its blunt certainty. It reduces complex historical moments into a charge of culpability. That rhetorical move is designed to sharpen accountability. It invites voters, historians, and the public to examine whether early warnings were heeded, whether deterrence mechanisms were sufficient, and whether intelligence was adequately interpreted. As you listen to these words, remember that they do not exist in a vacuum. They are part of a sustained conversation among policymakers, journalists, and citizens about what constitutes a successful foreign policy. Is it the avoidance of war? Is it the maintenance of order? Is it the projection of influence? Or is it the protection of human life? The Speaker's comments force us to confront these competing values. We should also note how moral language and strategic language coexist in the same breath. The phrase, "it's a horrible war," is ethical. Tomahawks and tariffs are pragmatic. The Speaker blends both registers as if to say, we must feel the human cost while also calculating the next move. That interplay is the essence of mature statecraft, yet it is also the root of moral tension. How do we balance empathy and efficacy? How do we act without becoming the very thing we oppose? Finally, consider the role of public testimony in wartime. These comments are not private. They are delivered into microphones and onto screens. Their audience is broad, domestic voters, foreign partners, soldiers on the front, and leaders in distant capitals. Each listener will extract a different lesson. Some will hear admonition, some will hear strategy, some will hear reassurance that the world has noticed the cost. That plurality of readings is the power and the peril of public speech. This narrative leaves us with no tidy conclusion. It refuses that comfort. Instead, it invites scrutiny and action. It asks leaders to choose differently, to end wars where endings are possible, and to marshal support where endurance is required. It asks citizens to demand accountability for errors of judgment and to seek humane solutions amid strategic constraints. In the end, the excerpt is a small prism through which a larger geopolitical drama refracts. It is about relationships between leaders, the unpredictability of conflict, the resilience of peoples, and the tools states use to pursue their aims. It is about the human ledger of loss and the political calculus of power. As you reflect on these words, hold two truths in mind. First, the moral reality. Real people suffer, families grieve, and nations are scarred. Second, the strategic reality. Choices made in rooms far from the front lines reverberate with real-world consequences. Both matter. Both must be part of how the world responds. So we return to the beginning and to that simple, devastating statement. It's a horrible war. Let those four words be an anchor. They demand empathy, clarity, and urgency. They demand from those who lead both the humility to recognize mistakes and the courage to seek endings. They demand from those who watch, citizens, journalists, and policymakers alike, the resolve to press for strategies that preserve life while defending the principles that matter. This is the story the passage tells. It is a story still being written page by leaders, soldiers, and citizens. It will shape elections, alliances, and histories, and it will be measured, ultimately, in whether war gives way to peace, whether wounded bodies are cared for, and whether the bonds between nations are rebuilt on the rubble of conflict. For now, the conversation continues. Voices will call for weapons, for tariffs, for diplomacy, and for patience. The moral ledger will be tallied in countless ways. The task now is to make decisions that reduce harm, reinforce deterrence where needed, and open avenues for negotiation. That is the unsparing obligation of leadership in troubled times. This is the account you have heard. It is candid, judged, and complicated. It refuses easy answers, insisting instead on the hard work of politics in the shadow of war. May it guide attention and provoke the debate necessary to find paths away from prolonged suffering and toward a more secure and humane order.